Welcome to Brat Surge Lecture Series. The first lecture is Stomach Anatomy and Physiology. These are 10-minute lecture series. The stomach is a gastrointestinal organ. It sits between the esophagus and the duodenum. Above it is the diaphragm. Laterally are the spleen and the liver, and the pancreas is posterior. Eating a bolus of food is what stimulates the stomach. The GE junction, which is here, is defined histologically as a mucosal change from squamous to columnar epithelium. It is a high-pressure zone known as the lower esophageal sphincter. The mid portion of the stomach is called the body. This contains most of the parietal cells where hydrochloric acid is manufactured, as well as pepsinogen-producing chief cells and ECL cells. It also stores gastric contents, and peristalsis is performed here. The most distal region of the stomach is called the antrum, and it contains G cells, which produce gastrin. The wall of the stomach is made up of mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Next, we are discussing the arterial supply to the stomach. The stomach is the most richly vascularized portion of the alimentary tract. In fact, you can ligate almost all vessels to the stomach and have it survive. Most of the blood supply to the stomach comes off of the celiac artery, which is a branch off of the aorta. We will review the arteries in just one moment. Of note, one of the vessels that supplies the portion of the lesser curvature of the stomach is the left gastric artery. About 20% of the time, it can give off a replaced left hepatic artery, or an artery that goes to the liver. If we ligate this and not knowing that it came off as an aberrant branch, it can lead to hepatic ischemia. Let's review the arterial supply to the stomach. Off of the aorta is the celiac artery, which gives off 3 blood vessels to the stomach, the first being the left gastric artery. The left gastric artery supplies the lesser curvature of the stomach. Next, a branch off of the celiac artery is also called the splenic artery. Off of the spleen and from the splenic artery, there are short gastric arteries. The short gastric arteries supply the upper portion of the greater curvature of the stomach, as well as the fundus. Additionally, the splenic artery, which is drawn straight here, but really it's very curvy, gives off the left gastroepiploic artery, which supplies the greater omen, the greater curvature of the stomach. So you can see we're drawing a lot of vessels. Next off the celiac is the common hepatic artery, which gives off the gastroduodenal artery and then continues on as the proper hepatic artery, supplying the liver. So this is the gastroduodenal artery. And the gastroduodenal artery is important because it gives off branches to the pancreas, as well as branches to the stomach, including the right gastroepiploic. and this supplies the pancreas. It is the superior pancreatico-duodenal artery. And we'll learn that it will collateralize with an artery from the superior mesenteric artery, which also gives off branches to the pancreas. This pretty much all shows that there's a lot of vascular supply to the stomach, which allows us to do sleeve gastrectomy for weight loss or gastric resections while ligating a lot of the vessels and still having the stomach survive. I'll just fill in this is splenic. Really, it's very curvy, and this is common hepatic. Next is innervation of the stomach, and it's primarily supplied by the vagus nerve, which generally comes down from the neck and the carotid sheath, and it enters the mediastinum, where it gives off the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and it divides into the left vagus nerve and the right vagus nerve. The left vagus nerve sits anteriorly on the esophagus, and the right is posterior. A vagotomy or ligation of the vagus trunks at certain regions will reduce acid production, and is sometimes performed to reduce acid production for peptic ulcer disease in severe cases. Next, we will review what is here is a gastric gland from the body of the stomach. When we eat and there is a food bolus, the food bolus itself triggers a series of events that leads to these gastric glands producing acid and substances to help digest our food. One such secretion is hydrochloric acid, which is produced by the gastric parietal cell. And over here, I will just draw a mechanism for which the parietal cell produces acid, because there's a lot of things that bind to it, and ultimately it's an ATP regulated event. Basically, the presence of a food bolus in the stomach stimulates the release of acetylcholine, which then, as we see here, binds to the parietal cell receptor, which triggers ultimately the production here of acid. Gastrin also helps produce hydrochloric acid, and it is secreted basically by the G cells in the stomach lining, mainly in the antrum of the stomach. Histamine also binds to the parietal cell receptor and is helpful in producing acid. It is produced by the ECL or enterochromaffin-like cells, and binds to the H2 receptors on the surface of the parietal cells, and stimulates, again, this ATP to produce acid. Another secretion by the chief cells here is a secretion called pepsinogen, and once activated, it becomes pepsin, which helps break down proteins, and it's basically activated again by acid in the stomach. Additionally, somatostatin basically puts the brakes on acid secretion. It will suppress acid secretion once the pH becomes a certain level. Lastly, parietal cells also produce intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor helps absorb vitamin B12 in the small intestine. Without it, you can develop pernicious anemia. Okay, that concludes the Stomach Anatomy and Physiology Brought Surge lecture series. Next up will be peptic ulcer disease. After the completion of the stomach lecture series, we will have test review.